My wife told everyone I was a failure who couldn't provide. She laughed at me at family dinner until her phone buzzed. The room went silent. What they saw on that screen destroyed the story she'd been telling about me for 8 years. She never saw it coming. Neither did I, until I made sure it would. My name is Clayton Merritt. I'm 46 years old. I work in agricultural logistics. Or I did, before the company I built in silence became worth more than anything I ever said out loud. I spent the better part of 2 decades optimizing grain elevator systems across the Midwest, managing crop flow schedules for regional co-ops, solving the kind of slow-moving operational disasters that don't make headlines but cost farmers real money. It wasn't glamorous. I wore steel-toe boots to most of my meetings. My hands knew the inside of a grain auger better than they knew a boardroom handshake. But I provided. I always provided. I married Ella in our late 20s. She was sharp, organized, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and immediately understand its social architecture. I admired that about her. We had Holden when I was 26. She was 23. Our son who grew up watching both of us work hard and pull in the same direction. At least, that's what I believed for a long time. Looking back, there were signs I chose to read generously. The way Ella would introduce me at her work events. Clayton's in agriculture. It's complicated to explain. The way she'd redirect conversations when someone asked what my company did. Small things. I told myself it was just her personality. She liked being the talker. I was the quiet one. That worked for us. Or it seemed to. The real shift started 8 years ago, when my mother Norma had a minor stroke. She was 63, lived alone outside of Ames, Iowa, and the doctors were clear. She needed consistent supervision and physical therapy 3 times a week for at least 6 months. My sister had moved to Oregon years back and had her own family. There was no one else. I didn't hesitate. I told my supervisor at Hargrave Distribution that I needed to reduce my schedule. He was decent about it. Moved me to a part-time field inspector role. The pay dropped from $79,000 to $51,000. I drove to my mother's house every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday morning. I helped her grip a pencil again. I sat with her through the frustration of an arm that wouldn't respond the way she needed it to. I paid the $380 gap in her medication coverage every month without telling anyone. When I told Ella about the pay cut, she went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with concern for my mother. It was the quiet of someone doing math. How long? She asked. 6 months, maybe 8, I said. She set down her coffee mug. Clayton, we have a mortgage. Holden's got 2 years of high school left. You can't just step back. She's my mother, I said. Ella nodded slowly. I know. I'm just saying, you always do this. You carry everything alone, and then we all feel the fallout. We all feel the fallout. That was the first time I heard that framing. I wouldn't understand what it meant until much later. That in her mind, my sacrifice wasn't noble. It was inconvenient, and inconvenient things needed to be explained. At the next family dinner, Ella's parents, her brother Wade, a couple of neighbors she liked to impress. She introduced my reduced schedule with a smile I'd seen her practice. Clayton's taking a step back from the big career push, she said lightly. Reassessing priorities. She laughed softly. Everyone laughed with her. I sat at that table and said nothing. Because what was I going to say? That I was wiping down my mother's kitchen every morning while she relearned how to button a shirt. That felt like something private. Sacred, even. I didn't know then that silence had a cost. That every time I let Ella narrate my life unchallenged, she was building a version of me that I'd eventually have to dismantle in front of 20 people. At a dinner table, on a night when her phone buzzed at exactly the wrong moment, and the whole room went still. That night was still years away. But it started here, at a kitchen table in Ames, with my mother's hand in mine, and a story already being told about me without my permission. I just hadn't started writing my own version yet. The first time Ella described me as flexible to someone's face, I almost laughed. We were standing in the driveway of her parents' house in Cedar Rapids. Her father, Gerald, grilling something on a back patio. Her mother, Patricia, arranging a cheese board with the concentration of a surgeon. Wade had just pulled in with his girlfriend, and when he asked what I'd been up to lately, Ella stepped in before I could open my mouth. Clayton's being flexible right now, she said brightly. Figuring out what the next chapter looks like. Wade nodded like that explained everything. It explained nothing. I was working field inspections, driving to grain elevators across 4 counties, auditing storage systems, filing compliance reports. It wasn't glamorous, but it was skilled work. I knew these facilities, knew which operators cut corners on aeration, which co-ops ran their temperature sensors 6 months past calibration. That knowledge had value. It just didn't have a title that impressed anyone at a dinner party. What bothered me wasn't Wade's nod. It was that Ella had the explanation ready before I did. That became a pattern over the following months. At her company Christmas party, he's in a transitional phase. Agriculture is funny like that. Lots of seasonal rhythms. At our neighbor's backyard barbecue, Clayton does his best work when nobody's watching. Kind of a behind-the-scenes guy. Always delivered with a warm smile. Always just slightly off. Always close enough to the truth that I couldn't point to a single lie. I brought it up once about 4 months in. We were doing dishes after one of her dinner parties, and I said, fairly calmly I thought, "You don't have to explain me to people." Ella dried her hands on a dish towel and looked at me with an expression I'd come to think of as her management face. "I'm not explaining you," she said. "I'm just filling in the gaps. You never say anything about yourself, Clayton. Someone has to." "I'm standing right there," I said. "And you're completely silent," she replied. "What do you want me to do? Just let it get awkward?" That was the first time I realized she didn't see it as a problem. She saw it as a service she was providing. What she didn't know, what I hadn't told her yet, was that those late nights after I got home from my mother's house weren't me sitting around. Norma's rehab had given me a specific kind of insomnia, the mind that won't stop running inventory. So I ran inventory on something useful. I've been watching grain elevator operators for 3 years, and what I kept seeing was the same systemic failure. Preventive maintenance schedules that existed only on paper, cost overruns that nobody upstream ever connected to equipment downtime, inefficiencies that a first-year engineer could identify if anyone bothered to look. So I built a tracking model, then a better one. Then I started writing operational auditing protocols that could be adapted across facilities without requiring an on-site engineer full-time. I wasn't thinking about a business yet. I was thinking about the problem. That's how it always starts. Or at least that's how it started for me. Ella walked past my laptop one night, glanced at the screen. "You're still working on that spreadsheet thing?" "It's a maintenance scheduling framework," I said. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite dismissal, but lived somewhere between the two. "Clayton, you need a real plan, not a spreadsheet project." I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just saved my work and closed the laptop. 2 weeks later, I drove out to the Granger Co-op facility near Ankeny, a client from my field inspection days, and show their operations manager what I'd built. He looked at it for 20 minutes without saying a word. Then he asked if he could share it with their district director. I said sure. That was the beginning, but I didn't know it yet. What I knew was this. At every family dinner that fall, something in Ella's performance was sharpening. The jokes about my flexible schedule developed a slight edge. At Thanksgiving, Wade, Ella's parents, a couple she'd been cultivating from her office, she said something that stuck with me longer than it should have. Someone asked if I had any big projects coming up. Before I could speak, Ella tilted her head and said, with a smile so polished it almost looked natural, "Clayton's happiest when the expectations are low. Aren't you, honey?" The table laughed. I smiled. Inside, something went very quiet and very deliberate. That night, after everyone left and Ella was upstairs, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall for a long time. I thought about my Uncle Lester, who'd sold his agricultural equipment business for just over $3 million back when I was in my 20s. He told me once, "Boy, never build something on land someone else controls." I hadn't understood it then. I was beginning to understand it now. I opened my laptop, pulled up the framework, added 3 new data fields I've been thinking about for a week, saved it under a new folder name, Meridian Grain Solutions, internal. Not a business. Not yet. Just a name. But names have weight. I was starting to feel mine again. The offer came on a Thursday in March, 3 years after my mother's stroke. A regional agricultural distribution company out of Des Moines, Heartland Grain Partners, was expanding their operations division and needed a director, someone with field experience, systems knowledge, and the kind of practical background that doesn't come from business school. Their HR director, a woman named Carol Pratt, called me directly. She'd gotten my name from the operations manager at Granger Co-op, who'd apparently been telling people about my maintenance framework for months. The salary was $118,000. Full benefits. A team of 7 reporting to me. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a grain elevator outside Ames and read the offer email 3 times. Then I called Uncle Lester. "Take it," he said before I'd finished reading him the details. "Don't think. Don't negotiate yet. Just say yes and sort the rest out." I told him I'd sleep on it. He made it sound like I'd just said I was going to walk to California. That night, I didn't tell Ella right away. Not because I wanted to hide it. I just wanted to hold it for a few hours. Let it be real and mine before it became a discussion. I'd learned that much about myself. I needed to stand on solid ground before I invited someone else onto it. I told her Friday morning over coffee. She looked up from her phone, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw something genuine in her expression, something close to pride. Then the question started. "What are the travel requirements?" she asked. "Some. Quarterly facility visits, maybe monthly during harvest season." "And your mother's appointments?" "I'd work around them. It's manageable." She was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee in slow circles. "Clayton, you've been out of a leadership role for 3 years. Do they know that?" "They know my background," I said. "They came to me. I'm just saying, the gap might be an issue. People notice gaps." I told her it wasn't a gap. It was a career adjustment, and that the work I'd been doing in the field was directly relevant. She nodded slowly, in that way that meant she wasn't convinced but had decided not to press further. I took that as agreement. On Monday, I called Carol Pratt and told her I was interested. We scheduled a formal interview for the following Wednesday. I spent the weekend preparing, reviewing my operational frameworks, updating my project history, writing out answers to the kinds of questions I expected. I was ready, more than ready. Tuesday evening, my phone rang. It was Carol Pratt again, but her voice had changed. Careful, professional in the way people get when they're delivering news that makes them uncomfortable. "Mr. Merritt," she said, "I want to be transparent with you. We received a call yesterday from someone who identified themselves as a family member. They raised some concerns about your availability and long-term reliability, given ongoing personal obligations." My chest went cold. I kept my voice steady. "What kind of concerns?" "They mentioned caregiving responsibilities that they felt might conflict with the demands of a director-level role. I want you to know we take these things seriously, and we felt we had to disclose it." After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. The house was quiet. Holden was at school. Ella was at her office downtown. Only one person had known about that interview. When Ella came home that evening, I was at the kitchen table with my hands flat on the surface in front of me. She set down her bag and read the room immediately. She was always good at that. "What happened?" she asked. "You called them," I said. She didn't deny it immediately. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. And that small act, the deliberateness of it, told me she'd already prepared for this conversation. "I called HR," she said finally. "I expressed some concerns. I was trying to protect us." "From what?" "From you overcommitting," she said. "Clayton, your mother still needs you 3 mornings a week. A director role at a company that size. The travel alone would." "You didn't ask me," I said. "You didn't say a word. You waited until I was one phone call away from something real, and then you went around me." Her jaw tightened. "I was thinking about this family." "You were thinking about the narrative," I said, "and whether my success fit it." She stood up. "That's not fair." Neither was the phone call. She went upstairs. I stayed at the table until the house was fully dark. Then I opened my laptop, pulled up the Meridian Grain Solutions folder, and I made a decision that I should have made months earlier. I wasn't going to announce anything. I wasn't going to argue for my own credibility. I was going to build something so undeniably real that no phone call could touch it. I registered the LLC the next morning. Used my middle name, Clayton Ray Merritt, filed under Ray Meridian Consulting. Paid the $150 filing fee from a checking account Ella didn't know about. Not because I was hiding money, because I was done building on land someone else controlled. Uncle Lester had told me that years ago. I'd finally stopped being too proud to listen. The first year of Ray Meridian Consulting was not a success story. Let me be clear about that. It was a grind, the kind that doesn't make it into business profiles because it's mostly unglamorous and mostly solitary, and mostly involves sitting at a kitchen table at 11:30 at night wondering if you're fooling yourself. I had 4 clients in year 1, all of them from my field inspection days, co-op managers and elevator operators who'd seen my maintenance framework in action and wanted something more formalized. The work was simple. I came in, audited their operational systems, identified the inefficiencies, built them custom scheduling and maintenance protocols, and left them with documentation they could actually use. No retainer, no ongoing contract, just project work. Revenue that first year, $58,000. Less than my reduced salary at Hargrave. Not impressive. But every dollar of it was mine, built in hours no one else saw, answerable to no one but the clients who'd called me directly. My mother Norma noticed something during those months. We were sitting on her back porch one October morning after her therapy session. She was doing well by then, left arm nearly back to full strength, and she looked at me over a coffee mug and said, "You're quieter than you used to be. But it's a different kind of quiet. Good different or bad different?" I asked. She considered that. The kind that means you're thinking instead of shrinking. I didn't tell her about the company. Not yet. Not because I didn't trust her. There was no one on earth I trusted more. But because I'd learned something from the Heartland situation. The moment a thing becomes speakable, it becomes vulnerable. I needed it to be strong enough to survive daylight before I let it out into the open. At home, Ella's commentary continued its steady evolution. The flexible phase had passed. Now I was in the passion project phase. That's the word she'd started using when people asked about my work. He's been doing some passion project consulting, she'd say, with an inflection that managed to sound both supportive and faintly pitying. Like I was a retired man who'd taken up woodworking. At Wade's birthday dinner in November, someone asked how business was going. Ella answered, "Clayton's got some clients here and there. Small stuff, but he enjoys it." She reached over and patted my hand like she was complimenting a child's drawing. Wade raised his glass. "Good for you, man. Keeping busy." I smiled, said thank you, kept my hands calm on the table. That same week, I got a call from a distribution facility in Sioux City, a mid-size operation that had been referred by one of my existing clients. They were hemorrhaging money on emergency repair costs because their maintenance scheduling was entirely reactive. Their floor manager, a straight-talking guy named Dale Hutchins, told me they'd lost $340,000 the previous year to unplanned downtime alone. I drove up on a Wednesday, spent 6 hours walking the facility floor, talking to the equipment operators, reviewing their maintenance logs. By Friday, I had a full operational audit on his desk. Dale looked it over, asked 2 questions, and signed a contract. That contract was worth $47,000. For 8 weeks of work. I sat in my truck in their parking lot after the signing and looked at the number on the page for a long moment. Then I put the truck in gear and drove to my mother's house. She was in the kitchen making soup. "Good day," she asked without turning around. "Better than most," I said. I sat at her table, and she put a bowl in front of me without asking. Outside, the November wind was pushing dead leaves across the yard in long, patient lines. I thought about the phone call I hadn't made, the voice recording I hadn't found yet, the dinner table I hadn't sat at for the last time. All of that was still ahead of me. But right there, in my mother's kitchen with soup getting cold and a signed contract in my jacket pocket, I let myself feel the ground under my feet for the first time in years. It was solid. I'd built it myself, and it wasn't going anywhere. By the 3rd year of Ray Meridian Consulting, I had clients in 6 states. Not large corporations, mid-sized co-ops, regional distribution hubs, independent grain elevator operators who've been burned enough times by overpriced software vendors to appreciate someone who actually walked their floor. Revenue that year crossed $1.1 million. I reinvested most of it, hired 2 part-time field analysts, built a documentation system that could scale. I still drove the same truck, still wore the same boots, still came home most evenings to a house where Ella described what I did as tinkering to anyone who asked. The irony had stopped bothering me. What bothered me, by that point, was something else entirely. About 8 months before the Harborline Capital conversation began, I started noticing small movements in our joint finances. Not dramatic. Ella was too careful for dramatic. But over the course of a few months, I watched $3,000 here and $4,500 there migrate from our joint account to what she'd registered as a household management account she'd opened 2 years earlier. I'd known about the account. I hadn't known it was becoming a destination. I didn't confront her. I kept records instead, printed statements, dated them, filed them in a folder in my truck's glove compartment, which Ella never touched. What I didn't know, what I only pieced together later, was that she'd also had a quiet consultation with a divorce attorney named Miranda Vaughn sometime in that same window. I found out through a detail so small it almost didn't register. a billing statement from Vaughn Legal Group that slipped out of Ella's laptop bag onto the kitchen floor. She picked it up fast, but not fast enough. I said nothing. I photographed it with my phone while she was upstairs. Around that same time, Harborline Capital reached out. Their approach came through a trade journal editor who'd published a short piece about operational efficiency gains in Midwestern grain logistics. He'd quoted one of my clients without naming me, but someone at Harborline had tracked the work back to Ray Meridian. Their managing partner, a man named Thomas Aldridge, called on a Wednesday afternoon while I was parked outside a co-op in Marshalltown. He was direct. Harborline had been watching the agricultural logistics consulting space. They'd identified Ray Meridian as a high-growth firm with disciplined fundamentals. They wanted to explore acquisition. I asked him to send a preliminary NDA before we talked further. He said it would be in my inbox within the hour. It was. The due diligence process was quiet and surgical. Harborline's analysts requested 3 years of financials, client contracts, retention data, and operational metrics. I provided everything through a secure portal. No announcements, no discussions. Ella saw me working late those weeks and asked once if I was taking on too much. Just a big client review, I said. She nodded and went back to whatever she was watching. The preliminary valuation came in at between $34 and $39 million. I sat with that number for 2 full days before I let myself believe it was real. Then I called Uncle Lester. Well, he said after a long pause, that's what happens when you build on your own land. The formal meeting in Chicago was scheduled for a Tuesday in late September. I flew out on a Monday evening, stayed in a hotel that cost less than what I usually charge for a day of field work, and spent the night reviewing my documentation. Harborline's partner team included 3 people. Thomas Aldridge was composed and precise. His colleague Ben Harwick was the numbers man, thorough, a little cold, exactly who you want reviewing your financials. The third partner was Daphne Kincaid. Daphne was 52, silver-haired, with the kind of direct eye contact that told you she'd heard every version of every pitch and was waiting to hear something she hadn't. She asked most of the questions. Your growth has been entirely referral-based, she said, flipping through the client acquisition history. No marketing spend to speak of. The work speaks, I said. That's a fragile model for some operators, she replied. Not when the referrals come from floor managers, I said. They don't recommend people to protect relationships. They recommend people because their operation depended on it. Daphne looked at me for a moment. Then she wrote something in her notes. Later, when Thomas stepped out to take a call, she said something I didn't expect. Do you have family support for a transition like this? I kept my expression neutral. I have what I need. She studied that answer longer than the question warranted. Then she said, quietly, my first husband told everyone at parties that I ran a small catering side business. I was clearing $2.3 million annually by the time we divorced. She closed her notebook. Just making conversation. She wasn't making conversation. She was telling me she already knew the shape of my situation without my having said a word. The closing date was set for October 19th. Ella's annual fall dinner was October 19th. I noticed the coincidence when I put it in my calendar. I left it there. The week before the closing, I drove to my mother's house on a Wednesday evening. Not her therapy day, just because I needed to sit somewhere that felt honest. Norma was in her living room with a book she wasn't reading. She set it down when I came in and looked at me the way she always did when she could tell I was carrying something too heavy to mention, casually. Sit down, she said. I sat. We talked about ordinary things for 20 minutes. Her neighbor's new dog, a roof repair she was putting off, whether Holden had called recently. Then she refilled my coffee without asking and said, now tell me what's actually going on. I looked at the cup in my hands. I may be selling the company. She didn't react the way most people would. She just nodded once, slowly, like I'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. How much? Close to $38 million. The number sat in the room between us for a long moment. Outside, a car passed on the quiet street. The refrigerator hummed. Does Ella know? She asked. No. She was quiet for a moment. Are you going to tell her before it's public? I've been asking myself that question for 2 weeks. No, I said. Norma set down her own cup. She didn't lecture me. She didn't ask me to reconsider. She just said, make sure you're doing this because it's right. Not because you want to watch her face. The honesty of it landed square in my chest. I thought about it. I said, I'm doing it because the last time I announced something real, she made a phone call. I won't give her that chance again. My mother nodded slowly. Then be clean about it. No drama. Just truth. I stayed for another hour. When I left, she walked me to the door and held my arm for a moment before letting go. You build something real, Clayton. Whatever happens at that dinner table, nobody can unbuild it. I drove home through the dark in silence. 2 days before the closing, I was washing dishes after dinner when I heard it. A sound from the hallway. Ella's voice, low and rehearsed. I turned off the water and stood still. Through the half-open bedroom door, she was facing the full-length mirror on the closet door, speaking quietly to her own reflection. The words were careful, measured. The tone was the one she used at dinner parties when she wanted to sound thoughtful rather than cutting. I heard the phrase clearly, he's never really been built to provide. And that's okay. Not everyone is. She was practicing it, word by word, testing the rhythm of it in her mouth, like a speech she intended to deliver. I stood in the hallway for 10 seconds. Then I walked back to the kitchen, dried my hands on a dish towel, and sat down at the table. She came downstairs 20 minutes later, cheerful and composed, asking if I wanted anything from the store tomorrow. I said no thank you. She went to bed. I sat at the table until midnight. Not out of anger, out of clarity. On the morning of October 19th, I checked my phone before I got out of bed. The wire confirmation from Harborline had already arrived. The closing had processed at 6 a.m. Eastern. $38 million, minus fees and retained equity, in a business account registered under my name. Downstairs, Ella was already moving through the kitchen with the energy she always brought to her dinner preparations. She had a guest list of 22. She'd ironed the tablecloth the night before. She'd ordered 2 bottles of wine. She couldn't actually afford to impress people who probably wouldn't notice. She looked up when I came downstairs and said, "Don't forget, everyone's here at 6. Dress like you care." I poured myself coffee. "I'll be there," I said. She didn't hear anything in my voice. She was already back to her list. That evening, her phone would buzz, and the version of me she'd been rehearsing in the mirror would stop being the one anyone believed. I arrived home at 5:44 p.m. with a briefcase that held closing documents and a wire confirmation I hadn't shown anyone. The house smelled like roasted garlic, and something Ella had spent the afternoon preparing specifically because it photographed well on her social media. She hosted the way other people performed, every detail calibrated for effect. She didn't look up when I came in. "You're late," she said from the kitchen. "Wade's already here." I set my keys on the console table and moved through the house. Wade was in the living room with his girlfriend Amber, holding a drink and talking about a property he was looking at. He nodded at me. I nodded back. We had the kind of relationship that ran entirely on surface pleasantries, which suited both of us fine. By 6 o'clock, 22 people were seated around the extended table. Ella's parents at one end, her co-workers and neighbors filling the middle, Holden across from me looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He was home from college for the weekend. Ella had timed the dinner around his visit without asking him if that worked. The first half hour was the usual noise. Real estate prices, someone's new car, a college football game. I sat and ate and said little. That wasn't unusual. Nobody expected me to be the loudest voice in the room. Then the conversation shifted the way it always did at these dinners. Toward money, toward ambition, toward the unspoken rankings that Ella's social circle maintained like a religion. Wade leaned back in his chair and looked at me with that grin he'd been perfecting for 8 years. "So Clayton, still doing the AG consulting thing? Any big clients lately?" Before I could answer, Ella set down her fork. "He's got a few small accounts," she said smoothly. "It keeps him productive." She smiled in my direction. Not at me, exactly. More at the space where a more impressive version of me was supposed to be standing. Clayton's always been better with the hands-on work than the big picture stuff. Holden shifted in his seat. I caught the movement, but didn't look at him directly. Ella's father, Gerald, cleared his throat. "Work is work," he said, in the mild tone he used when he wanted to soften something without actually contradicting his daughter. Ella reached for her wine glass. "Of course. I just think, and I've always said this, that a man who's content doing small-scale work his whole life is a man who stopped growing somewhere along the way." She looked around the table with an expression of warm reasonableness, the way she always looked when she said something she'd been building toward all evening. "If you had actually done something with your life, Clayton, I wouldn't spend half my time explaining you to people. He's just not built for the bigger stage, you know? The laugh that followed was small and social, the kind that isn't really laughter, just the sound a room makes when it doesn't know what else to do. And then, 3 seconds later, her phone buzzed against the tablecloth. She glanced at it reflexively, frowned, picked it up. I watched her read it. I watched the color shift in her face, not dramatically, but the way a window fogs when the temperature changes outside. Her lips parted slightly. Wade's phone buzzed next, then Gerald's, then one of her co-workers near the far end of the table. Wade turned his screen toward his girlfriend. His eyebrows went up. "What is it?" Amber asked. Wade didn't answer immediately. He looked at me instead. His expression was something I'd never seen from him before. Not the grin, not the easy condescension. Something closer to reassessment. He turned his phone outward so the people nearest him could see the headline. Regional Agriculture Business Journal. Ray Meridian Consulting acquired by Harborline Capital. Preliminary valuation, $38 million. The photograph was small but clear. Me, in the navy jacket I'd worn to the Chicago meeting. The Harborline offices behind me. The room didn't erupt. It went still, the kind of still that has weight. Ella was looking at her phone like it had said something in a language she didn't recognize. "This is you," she said quietly. Not a question. "Yes," I said. "You didn't. You never told me this was." "You never asked what I was building," I said. My voice was level. No heat in it. Just fact. Holden had his own phone out now, reading. His eyes moved to me slowly. "Dad," he said, "it says 38 million. "That's correct," I said. I reached down and picked up the briefcase I'd set beside my chair when I sat down. The sound of the clasps opening was small in the silence. I placed a thin folder on the table in front of Ella. She stared at it. "What is that?" "Documentation," I said. "Start with the top page." She didn't touch it immediately, but Wade leaned forward and read the visible header upside down. And what moved across his face told me he understood what it was before Ella did. The top page was a printed copy of the HR correspondence from Heartland Grain Partners. The one that referenced a call from a family member. The one that had arrived 4 years ago and cost me a $118,000 directorship before I'd even had a chance to prove myself. Ella's hand moved toward the folder, then stopped. The table was completely silent now. Not the comfortable silence of people digesting a good meal. The silence of 22 people recalibrating everything they thought they knew. Nobody reached for the wine after that. I noticed it because the bottle was sitting in the middle of the table and not one person touched it for the next 20 minutes. Small detail. But in a room that had gone that still, small details were the only things moving. Ella's hand was still resting near the folder, but not on it. Like she was deciding whether opening it would make things better or worse. I watched her calculate. Wade broke the silence first. "That's an HR letter," he said flatly. "From a job offer." "It is," I said. "What job offer?" Gerald asked, with the careful tone of a man who suspected the answer was going to change something permanent. Ella straightened in her chair. "I need everyone to understand the context." "Read the letter, Ella," I said quietly. She looked at me. Something passed between us. Not anger, not the performative hurt she sometimes deployed in arguments. Just the recognition that this was no longer a room she controlled. She picked up the top page and read it. I watched her eyes move across the lines. When she finished, she set it down. "That was 4 years ago," she said. "I was trying to protect." "You were trying to protect the story," I said. "The one where I was the background, and you were the one holding things together." A $118,000 director role didn't fit that story. Wade leaned back in his chair and ran a hand through his hair. He looked at his sister with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Not protective, not complicit. Something approaching honest. "Mel," he said, using the nickname he only used when he was serious. "Did you actually call them?" Ella didn't answer Wade directly. She looked at me. "You kept that letter for 4 years. "I kept a copy," I said. "I also kept the voicemail transcript they forwarded to HR. The one where you described my caregiving responsibilities as a long-term reliability concern." I reached into the folder and placed the second page in front of her. "Your exact phrasing was a history of prioritizing personal obligations over professional commitments. You said that about a man who was helping his mother relearn how to hold a fork." The table was very quiet. Ella's mother Patricia pressed her lips together, but said nothing. Gerald stared at his plate. Holden spoke from across the table. His voice was quiet but steady. steadier than I expected. You told me for years that Dad wasn't driven, he said. That he was happy being small. He looked at his mother directly. You told me that. Holden. Ella started. I believed you, he said. He looked down his phone, then back up at me. I'm sorry, Dad. I should have asked questions instead of just accepting it. It landed squarely. I met his eyes. You were working with what you had, I said. That's not on you. Ella pushed back her chair and stood. This is not what this dinner was supposed to be. I know, I said, but it's what it is. She walked to the kitchen. Not dramatically, just away. I let her go. Around the table, the guests exchanged looks that ranged from uncomfortable to openly stunned. One of her co-workers near the far end quietly showed his wife something on his phone. Another article, probably. The regional business journal had linked the story to 3 trade platforms. By now it had been shared a dozen times. Wade stood and walked to the kitchen doorway. I could hear the low sound of their voices, but not the words. After a few minutes, he came back and sat down next to me. He didn't say anything immediately, just sat there with his elbows on the table and looked at the center of the room. Then, quietly, he said, I owe you an apology. For the jokes. For the keeping busy comments. All of it. I know, I said. I was following her lead, he said. That's not an excuse. I'm just saying it out loud. I nodded. Saying it out loud is a start. Holden came around the table and sat in the empty chair beside me. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, close enough that his shoulder was near mine. That meant more than any speech could have. The guests began drifting out around 9. Some said brief, careful things to me on their way out. Congratulations, mostly delivered with the slightly stunned quality of people who weren't sure what they were congratulating exactly. One of Ella's co-workers, a man named Phil Garrett who'd made one too many flexible schedule jokes over the years, shook my hand and held it a beat longer than necessary. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. After the last car left, I went back inside. Ella was at the kitchen table, the folder open in front of her. She'd read all of it. I could tell by the order the pages were in, rearranged, not as I'd placed them. She looked up when I came in. Her face was tired in a way I hadn't seen before. Not performing anything, just tired. How long? She asked. 3 years building it, I said. 8 months with Harbor Line. She nodded slowly. And you never said a word. I said plenty of words over the years, I replied. You edited them. She was quiet for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked once and then stopped. Finally, she said, I didn't think you had it in you. That sounds terrible, but it's true. I know, I said. What happens now? She asked. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. That depends entirely on whether you want to be honest, I said. Not managed. Not curated. Honest. She looked at the folder. Then at me. I don't know if I know how to do that. Then that's where we start, I said. The divorce filing arrived 9 days after the dinner. Not from Ella directly, from Miranda Vaughn's office, delivered by certified mail on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing Harbor Line's integration timeline at my kitchen table. The envelope was cream-colored and professional. I set it beside my coffee and opened it without hurry. Miranda Vaughn had a reputation in Cedar Rapids for aggressive asset discovery. She was thorough, methodical, and known for finding financial structures that other attorneys missed. Ella had chosen well, tactically speaking. What Miranda hadn't anticipated was Karen Wells, my own attorney, whom I'd retained 6 months earlier through a referral from a business contact in Des Moines. Karen was 61 years old, had practiced business and family law for 35 years, and had the specific quality of someone who had seen every variation of every financial maneuver and stopped being surprised by any of them sometime around 2003. When I walked in her office with the divorce filing and my full documentation, the LLC registration history, the Heartland Grain Partner correspondence, the printed bank statements showing Ella's transferred funds, Karen reviewed everything for 40 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up. The Ray Meridian LLC registration predates your most recent joint tax filing that shows consulting revenue by 16 months, she said. I know, I said. Miranda Vaughn is going to argue commingling, that the business grew during the marriage using shared resources. The operating account was separate from day one, I said. Opened the same week as the registration. Karen nodded slowly. Then she's going to argue that your reduced income during the caregiving years constituted a marital contribution that entitles Ella to a larger share of the acquired assets. I paid my mother's medication gap out of a personal account that predated the marriage, I said. Every month for 4 years. I have the records. Karen looked at me over her reading glasses. You've been documenting this for a while. Since the Heartland phone call, I said. She set down her pen. Then here's what happens next. We file a response that establishes the LLC as a pre-revenue separate asset, document the independent operating account, and present the HR correspondence as evidence of interference with a marital economic opportunity. She paused. That last piece is significant. Courts take a dim view of spouses who sabotage employment prospects. Miranda Vaughn's discovery requests arrived 3 weeks later. They were extensive, 7 years of financial records, client contracts, correspondence with Harborline. We provided everything Karen had cleared. The requests that reached into the LLC's premarital registration period came back with a clean legal boundary drawn around them. 2 months into the process, Miranda filed a motion to compel additional financial disclosures. Karen filed a counter-motion citing the Heartland correspondence and the documented fund transfers Ella had made in the weeks before the dinner. The judge reviewed both. The counter-motion was granted. The following week, Ella's attorney requested a settlement conference. I sat across from Ella in a conference room on the 4th floor of a downtown office building. She looked composed but tired, the particular tiredness of someone who'd been fighting a battle they'd expected to win quickly and hadn't. Miranda Vaughn sat beside her, equally composed, considerably more neutral. The settlement terms were finalized over 4 hours. Ella received the house, which I'd already valued and set aside in the asset calculations. She received half of the joint savings, including the funds she'd transferred preemptively, which the court had flagged and returned to the joint pool. She received no claim on Ray Meridian Consulting or the Harborline acquisition proceeds, given the registration date and independent account history. Miranda Vaughn didn't argue the LLC point past the first hour. She was too experienced to fight a documented timeline. When it was over, Ella and I stood briefly in the hallway outside the conference room. She looked at me with the same tired clarity she'd had at the kitchen table the night of the dinner. You were ready for this, she said. Not accusatory, just recognizing it. I've been ready for a lot of things, I said. Most of them didn't go the way I planned. She nodded once. Then she walked toward the elevator. I walked toward the stairs. 8 months after the dinner, I drove out to Norma's house on a Saturday morning with no particular agenda, except to sit somewhere that felt like the truth. She was on the back porch with coffee and a crossword puzzle she'd given up on. She handed me a mug before I'd asked for one, which was her version of a welcome mat. We sat for a while without talking. A red-tailed hawk was working the field at the edge of her property. Slow, patient circles, no urgency. You look different, she said eventually. Different how? I asked. Like a man who stopped waiting for permission, she said. I thought about that. Maybe. Holden had called me every week since the dinner. Not about the money, not about the legal proceedings, just to talk. About school, about a girl he was cautiously interested in, about a summer internship he was considering. In March, he'd asked if he could come work with Ray Meridian for the summer. Not for the title or the story he could tell. He was specific about that. He wanted to understand what I'd actually built. I told him to show up on June 2nd, ready to work. He said he'd be there. 3 weeks after the settlement, I drove to a grain distribution conference in Omaha, where Harborline was presenting the Ray Meridian integration as a case study in operational efficiency. I sat in the back row and listened to Thomas Aldridge outline the acquisition logic to a room of regional AG industry professionals. Halfway through the presentation, a man across the aisle turned to say something to his colleague, and I recognized him. Gary Plummer, former operations director at Heartland Grain Partners, the company that had rescinded my director offer 4 years ago after Ella's phone call. He was heavier now, with the look of a man who'd spent those years in a comfortable chair. He recognized me about 30 seconds after I recognized him. His expression moved through several stages quickly. Surprise, recalibration, something between discomfort and respect. At the break, he crossed the room and extended his hand. Clayton Merritt, he said. I heard your name in the presentation. Gary, I said. I shook his hand, held it a normal amount of time. He seemed to be deciding whether to address the history directly. He decided yes. We should have handled that situation differently, he said. The call we received. It wasn't right that we acted on it without contacting you. No, I said. It wasn't. He nodded. We stood there for a moment, two men on either side of a decision that had cost one of us, and, in the long run, cost the other nothing visible, but probably something real. Congratulations on the acquisition, he said, genuinely. Thanks, Gary, I said, and walked back to my seat. That evening I stopped at Norma's on the way home. She was already in for the night, but she'd left the porch light on. I sat on the front steps for 20 minutes, watching the dark field across the road. I thought about what she'd said the morning before the closing. You built something real, Clayton. Nobody can unbuild it. She was right. And what I understood now, sitting on those steps in the quiet dark, was that the building hadn't been about proving anything to Ella. It hadn't been about the dinner table, or the headline, or the wire transfer. It had been about the simple, unglamorous, permanent fact of standing on ground I'd made with my own hands. The hawk was gone from the field. Somewhere out in the dark, something small moved through the grass. The night held it all without comment. I got in my truck and drove home.